Okay, to begin with, here is the first body armor I made, and this is the second attempt I tried with polyester resin pieces. But as you can see, there was some concerns, and I abandoned this because the pieces were very brittle. So instead, I used the same molds that I used for this one to then cast these pieces out of polyurethane, and I've never looked back since. So I was able to then finally put together this small bodice uh, without sleeves, and it's got a front and a back. And here we can get a glimpse of what it looks like from the inside. But here were some of my first attempts at trying to use a whole system that is based off ancient Assyrian scales, and we learned how to string our pieces together and put them together in a fashion like this with no backing whatsoever. So here we're finally on the right track, but there is still some concerns regarding the shape, the type of cut, and the specific plates of armor themselves. So I decided to make some historical ancient Assyrian scales, and here we can see this made from polyurethane resin cast pieces as well, which in this case will be painted iron, so a color similar to that. And this was more of a copperish color, and this one more of a bronze color. So here we've got ancient Assyrian scales with hole systems, and the scales are made to correct measurements as well. And while that was the beginning of a tunic or a knee-length coat, this one here is the first bodice I managed to put together using a different type of Assyrian scale, based off some scales that are in the British Museum, and it worked well. It works really well. It's got a lot of play, and even these shoulder areas tend to gather. So that's a huge advantage. However, I think this gap here is a bit worrisome. Also, this vulnerable thread is exposed here, and you can see it for each row. It should be, I believe, it should be covered. So although I had a win with this in trying to make a complete bodice with the fringe and in a lamla fashion, because there's no backing inside, I still believe that there is some question marks as to whether or not this is the correct stitching method. So before I tore it apart and painted the scales and then tried to put it back together, I would have ended up with the same thing that I've got now. So I thought I'll think about it a bit more and see if I can find some other solutions or some other methods that might be much more in line with these types of scales here. And I managed to come up with a method that I think is much more realistic after experimenting some more. So here are some examples of the same scales, and here is something that I think is much more accurate. And although this doesn't have a backing, it should. So what you see is holes here that haven't been filled in, and these would have been used to attach the rows, the horizontal rows, to a backing such as this. So here is one that I've done, a little sample of the same scales on a backing. You notice the stitching on the back is pretty minimal, and each row has been attached, starting with the bottom row first, and then in an offset pattern, which gives you the imbricated style of scale armor. It's not only offset, but it's also stitched on to the backing. And here you can see that two-hole system that's below the midrib, and how it gives you that crisscross pattern, which is very popular on ancient Assyrian reliefs, and it also protects that vulnerable this vulnerable row of stitching is protected, and it also doesn't allow for penetration in that respect, because each row is sitting on top of the one below it. So this gives you a much more realistic pattern for these holes, for this whole system of these particular types of scales. And you can see the amount of concertina that you can get. And if you think that's because that's not attached to a backing, well, here you go. This one is attached to a backing, and you've got pretty much total concertina here. So although, and that should give you an idea of what it looks like from the side. And this is the concertina that I believe they seem to be talking about in ancient Assyrian scale armor, and you have the ability for the scales to flex and move, but you also have this top row of stitching, which is securing the top row to the row below it and minimizes penetration from in here. Now it's still possible, or the scales to flip up in that fashion. So here is, I think, after playing around with this sample and copying some of the patterns, in this case, that you see in Hewlett's thesis, I thought this is something that's so that's a copy. This would be more appropriate. That's the copy from Hewlett's work, but this is the copy that, or the one that I was able to make. So that when this armor is going to get ripped apart, it'll be painted. All the pieces will be painted, and of course new pieces need to be made, because the pieces that I've got here are not enough to make a bodice with a back and two front panels that overlap, so you have double protection. This is a front part, that's a front part, this is the back part, and that goes around your body, and of course those are the shoulder parts that will be attached to the front, this one to that, and this one to that. So leather underlining will need to be made. That should give you an idea of the shape, and then once these plates have been pulled apart and painted, they'll be stitched onto the backing, which will be in a shape similar to that, but stitched up in this method. So that is a much more accurate way of stitching these scales, which also not only gives you a little bit more protection because of the overlap of the scales, but still gives you that flexibility that is required, and also protects that vulnerable lacing in here. So that vulnerable lacing that's exposed up at the top is totally protected. And even if you were to chop all these rows off, these scales will still be attached, and that the stitching that's behind the scales and on top is protected. And even this one that's used to stitch the armor to the back or to the backing is also protected. So here now what we have is the big nosy scales and the small nosy scales. So the nosy scales were found in a archaeological site that's near modern day Kirkuk in Iraq, and here you have the small version of the scales and then the big version of the scales. You see the big version is literally twice the size of that. Twice the size of those scales there. So here I've managed to put them together, as you can see, in a method that I believe is much more accurate than what has been suggested by some academics. It also accounts for the fact that in the Nuzi armor, apparently there's too many scales being used to create one coat. However, when you have big scales like these, and you layer them on so that from the side, I don't know if you can see that, but it's overlapped. So it's overlapping halfway down. Then now you can understand why they're using so many scales at this size, and it's because of the overlap. Again, I'll let you see it from the side. And what's the advantage of doing this is here now, if I was to hit here, not only do I have the scale beside it that's covering it from behind, but also underneath I've got another 2 layers of the row below that's actually protecting. So 4 layers. When you hit in this point, in this point, in this point, you're protected by 4 layers, in this case of bronze. So these coats of armor from Nuzi were very heavy, actually, very heavy as in protection wise, because you got double the protection in this method of lacing, and you still have all your concertina as well. So that gives you an idea of how it works. You can see. And again, at the back, here is that stitching, and you can see the broken stitch pattern, which is a very simple method of attaching the rows to the backing. And it's done in the same way as these, where you start by stitching your bottom row, and then this row halfway down, and in an imbricated pattern. What you can also see is, I don't know if you can see that, but that pattern is actually sitting the edges of the scales, and what's happening is it's acting like a railing system to guide the scales above how to slide down and then slide back up in that fashion. And likewise, the the sleeves as well would be like this, and this is also a better look. What I mean by that is, imagine if all your body armor was like this size, compared to your sleeves, which are this size. It looks weird. However, when you have it in a pattern like this, you can see they're overlapping half the way. It almost becomes the same size as this scale. That's visible, and even the overlap of these scales is very similar to that too. So you would have a bodice that matches the sleeves as well, but with much more protection, because here you got 4 layers of protection at any given point of piecing. Okay, so here we have some other attempts that I've tried with backing. So here you can get an idea, and here again you see that broken stitch pattern as a method of attaching the scales to the backing, leather backing, and this particular case, these scales, ancient Assyrian scales that were found in Kalhu, in the archaeological site of modern day Nimrod in Iraq, and this is identical to what we see on ancient Assyrian reliefs. These particular scales, there is some in the British Museum. I think they're the 270 type, and there is scales like this in the Metropolitan Museum as well. And this is a lacing pattern that is pretty much identical to what we see on ancient Assyrian reliefs. It's very interesting to see how this type of armor works. You can get an idea of the concertina that happens. So this pretty much folds up. You can see in to form double layers. So what's happening is one row, that row of stitching allows for that row to flex down, so that in a defensive position, if you were to crouch or slouch, your threads wouldn't be exposed. Actually, this is what you'd get, and you'd have to then penetrate the leather and two layers, which will give you 4 again. So this should give you an idea of how it's stitched together. So again, the same method that was used here and in all these examples. You start off by attaching your bottom row first. You string them up all in a row first with your 2 side ones again, and then you stitch them down to your backing, and then you put your row on top in an imbricated fashion. So here you can see it's actually offset, and then you layer them all the way up, and then when you stitch the tops down, you stitch them down from the top and work your way down the body armor. And now we know that when we see this style of ancient Assyrian body armor on ancient Assyrian soldiers, we can get an idea of how it actually worked. So that's a very interesting. Each one of those crosses, where the crosses is actually one row. So you see there's cross lacing, and then there's nothing, like it's just the scales, and then the cross lacing again, and then the scales, and you work your way up like that. This here I'm trying to figure out how to attach those small scales that were found alongside these scales. So here you can see the long skinny scales, and I'm trying to figure out how to stitch them down so that we can incorporate these small scales along with this style of body armor. So something like that. And here are some more examples that I've done. Again, on the back you can see that broken stitch pattern here. These scales are actually these ones here, but with rounded ends. So I've rounded the ends where there's two holes below the midrib, and they give me this scale, and it's very similar in construction type to these big nosy scales, and they're also, as you can see, overlaid so that this bottom row is overlapped by the top row by half, and you get that crisscross pattern of stitching, which closes it off, but you still get all your concertina that you require. So to give you an idea of what's going on, I'm stitching this row down first, and then what happens is, as you can see, you got that step pattern that happens because of the overlay side by side of the scales in the rows, and they will lock into these so that the edges that are under here, these edges that are under here, will end up locking up against the midrib and the edges of the scales here, and form track-like, like a track to guide then the scales above when they slide down in that fashion. Here you can see it's in an imbricated pattern, so you get your offset naturally when you butt your scales up to the hard edge of the row below. That gives you the exact offset to get the imbricated pattern. You got 1, 2 offset, 3 offset, so that this one, the fourth row, when you put it on, this edge will actually line up with that edge there. So if I was to put a ruler here, this row and this row actually line up. So you get 1 offset, 2 offsets, and then you start like that. So what happens is, once I've got all my rows on, here I had stitched them down, and then wanted to see what would happen in the worst case scenario if all my crisscrosses had been chopped. Here I've chopped all my crisscrosses, and you can see that even in this state, you still get all your concertina, and not only that, but you wouldn't lose your scales that easily, because those threads that are actually holding the scales in rows together are totally protected. So you see that top row and this row, they use together those stitchings are used together, the rows together, and this one here, so that this one here, this one here, this one here is used actually to stitch it to the back, the backing, the back cloth, and even that is protected in that imbricated fashion. So now, even if all my stitches were shredded, so for example, say it was like this, or crisscross, which it was, and then it got shredded for whatever reason, all of them, my scales would still be protecting me. However, in this case, it would end up becoming a typical scale construction. So we're still we're not going to lose our scales is my point here, even if all those cords were chopped. And the method of stitching, the top stitching that is done, is always done with these two holes. Sometimes in Assyrian scales you see one hole, sometimes two, but there always seems to be a hole at the bottom of the midrib, and that suggests to me that after the scales are put on in this method to a backing, then all the lacing is done on the top surface of the scales, starting from the top, working your way down. Because what happens is, if I was to start from the bottom, that ends up locking. So I'm using this hole to attach to this hole. If I was to stitch it from the bottom first, what happens is that then closes the access for me to be able to get underneath the scale to then stitch, access this hole to stitch it down to here. So it became quickly apparent that the correct way was to start from the top, stitch this row down to this row, and that still gives me access to then stitch this row down to this row and work my way down the body armor. So although these ones are not based off any, actually the whole system is based off these, and the proportions are also based off these scales. So the whole system here is the same one used here, but the proportions of the scales on the smaller scale are more in line with these ones. So that was my first attempt over here, using that whole system, which I think is a more correct method than what I have done over here. Now, these ones are iron scales that have been found in Nimrud, in the archaeological site of Nimrud as well. So these are actual Assyrian scales, and so are these. These are I think the 309s, type 309, and you can see how they work here again. These are very defensive in that, again, you have pretty much. So how can I show this here? So you can see this plate ends here. This top row is in line with that row. So here, for example, if I was to hit, I'd get that four layer of protection, one by the side and then the two underneath it, and still maintain my concertina, and also have a leather backing as well to be able to give some extra protection and to be able to tie these up in that fashion. Now, something important in the development of Assyrian armor from the time of the Nuzi armor types, which are that and that, to what we have here and here and here, you can see that the scales are much thinner, they're much smaller, and not only that, but they're pretty much using the method to work their way, after they've stitched the scales on, to then work their way down to tie the top row to the row underneath, so that you can't penetrate under here. And also what you notice is they've moved in these. You see where the hole is up at the top to stitch it to the backing here. Well, the Assyrians in this case, for example, have moved that particular hole down just above the midrib here, and in this case too, just above the midrib. But sometimes they've just totally forgot about it, and it's on purpose. What I mean by that is, if you're using these tiny scales and you've got to stitch them all to a backing, the last thing you want to do is have to stitch each individual scale to the back cloth. So this method of dropping the hole just above the midrib in order to stitch it down allows for a very quick and efficient method and gives you this pattern, this beautiful pattern, which also allows for for movement, imbrication of the actual backing itself. So what I mean by that is here, if I was to flex this armor, you can see that that broken stitch pattern gives the ability, it gives you room for even the leather to be able to compress, to take curves. So if you wanted it to curve, and that's why I think this broken stitch pattern method of attaching the scales to the backing is important and helps in the flexibility of the armor. But here you don't even have that. So how are you going to attach these? The way you're going to attach these is what they've done is, you notice here that the two gathering, the very top is a gathering, a stitch used to gather the rows, as well as this one here to gather the rows. But what they've done is they've centered it. It does two things. It minimizes the slippage that happens between the scales and locks them in tighter. But it can also here, as in this case, double up as your row to go through in order to attach your scales to your back cloth. And when you've got thousands of little scales to stitch onto a backing, okay, one extra less step you have to do. For example, if you've got thousands of scales and you have one less hole to drill, well then that's a thousand holes. For example, if you got 1,000 scales less for you to drill or to pierce, and it makes things a lot more efficient. Also, the dropping down of this hole lower instead of keeping it up at the top allows for a tighter stitch across in this method, and secures the scales much more than this method here, where that scale is that hole used to attach the scales to the back cloth is right up at the top. So yeah, the 309s is the same. So that was the same stitch pattern, and here is an example. So that's the 309s. That's a Syrian Armour scale iron one. And these ones as well from Met. I think this is a much more truer method that is almost identical. It literally is identical to the patterns that we see on ancient Assyrian reliefs regarding this armor. Alright, so here is where I ran out of scales. I have pretty much just enough polyurethane resin to be able to make all these square scales. And the main reason why I decided to go with this and not finish this one off is because I realize now that I need the backing for that. So I thought, if I start on a new project and finish this is the simplest type of scale that I've got, that I literally have to stitch on onto a backing. So what I've decided to do is to use this as a guide for the type of backing cut that I'm going to use to then recreate this armor in this method of stitching attached to a backing that is in a similar shape to that one there. So this is also another type of scale that we see in ancient Assyrian reliefs, and although the size that I've used for this scale is literally 2 fingers by 2 fingers, so it's about 4.25 by 4.25 centimeters each one, and they're just butted up next to each other. I haven't overlapped them so that I can still maintain my flex, as you can see, and because it's a very easy way for you to get a stitch that is sometimes shown on ancient Assyrian reliefs. However, it would incorporate another stitch going through each layer, so that there was two. In this case, I've only done one. So there's one stitch coming down here. You can see the other ones horizontally I haven't done on this bottom row, but I have up here. And then another horizontal should be going, and another vertical to cover from here, and that would give you that grid pattern stitching that you see for the square armor on ancient Assyrian reliefs. So the backing, here is the backing here. You can see the stitch pattern pretty much. Yeah, you can see I laid them, and before I could figure out exactly what type of size to make my backing, imagine these pieces I stitched together before I even painted them to figure out my size. And then once my size was figured out, I then used those measurements to cut my backing, and cut my backing cloth, and then painted them and started to stitch them on to the backing. Now I think this too is decent armor, because it gives you a double layer of protection. So I'm not so much concerned about the possibility of penetration, say between the layers in that respect, especially at the front, because you'll end up with a double layer. So you'll have two layers of scales, and two layers of leather as well to penetrate. And I think for these square armor, it's enough. Although there is ways to be able to overlap them and stitch them down in an imbricated pattern. So yeah, here I've run out of scales. I'm waiting for the supplier to get more stock. So they're out of stock and won't be in stock till sometime in February. So I probably won't get back into being able to produce more scales till about February. So I'm just playing around, killing some time, trying to get some more knowledge about ancient Assyrian scales and how they work, and trying to incorporate the new information that's been written about ancient Assyrian armor being found in Western China. And this is my cut. Although I've chopped the little wings off the side, they had little wings on the side, something similar to that, which I ended up chopping off. But you can see this gives you an idea of the pattern. I've tried it. I've tried it on from the front. I've tried it on from the back. I've put some extra cordage in a few spots, but yeah. So I'm giving that a go as well. But from this, it led me to the Met Museum armor that's very similar to the one that they found in Western China. So that one is what they believe to be an infantryman scale armor, which also has a skirt attached to the bottom. So that's what I'll be doing to this one here as well once I'm finished. That's why I've left some room down at the bottom to then cut out another piece that'll be a skirt, and stitch that down to the edge at the bottom. So that will be an entire uniform the body armor and the skirt will all be one, or at least that's what the plan is. So yeah, I'm still working on this one for the time being. Hopefully I can get myself busy with that. So when I'm finished that, I'll have a good idea of what to do when I pull this apart to make that with a backing as well. So that's why I haven't pulled this apart. I thought if I pull it apart and have to put it together, and I'm gonna do it with a backing, I need to find out what kind of cut to do the backing. So this gives me an idea now of what style of backing, how to cut it, and I'll be able to improve on this design because these plates are all square. I get square edges, especially around the armholes. So the advantage I'll have here is the fact that I'll be able to imbricate the pattern so that I can get a little bit more relief around these areas, which will be on the inside edge of the arm to go across my chest, and also imbricate this section here to give myself a little bit more space to move my arms back, which is an important move, and be able to move my arm over my shoulder to be able to pull an arrow out of a quiver and then shoot a bow with it. So yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm still around. I haven't given up yet, and I'm still just an Assyrian having fun, mate.